Tonight we're going to talk about a game that changed everything, not through explosive innovation or revolutionary mechanics, but through the quiet devastation of its storytelling, the precision of its atmosphere, and the courage of its themes. This is about Silent Hill 2, released on September 24th, 2001, for the PlayStation 2, a game that arrived just 2 years after the original Silent Hill established Team Silent's credentials, and 3 years after Resident Evil 2 proved survival horror could be blockbuster material. But where other horror games trafficked in zombies and corporate conspiracies, Silent Hill 2 dared to ask a different question. What if the real horror wasn't what's lurking in the fog, but what's lurking inside us? Close your eyes if you want to. Get comfortable. We're going to spend the next few hours walking through the gray streets of a town that doesn't really exist except as a reflection of guilt, grief, and the terrible things people do to those they claim to love. This isn't a review. This isn't even really a retrospective in the traditional sense. This is an examination, a slow, careful look at what Silent Hill 2 is, what it meant when it came out, and why it continues to matter more than 2 decades later. We'll trace the game's development under the shadow of its predecessor, explore its narrative in the detail it deserves, analyze the symbolism woven into every monster and environment, and understand why this particular horror story has resonated so deeply with players that it's been analyzed in academic papers, cited in other games, and remade nearly 25 years after its release. No jump scares here, no rushed pacing, just a methodical walk through the fog, examining what Team Silent created when they decided survival horror could be about something more than survival. The weight of expectations, Silent Hill 2's development. When Team Silent sat down to plan Silent Hill 2 in late 1999, they faced a peculiar challenge. The original Silent Hill had been a critical and commercial success, selling over 2 million copies and establishing Konami as a legitimate competitor to Capcom's Resident Evil dominance. But it had also been an exhausting creation. Director Keiichiro Toyama and his team had fought against technical limitations, uncertain directions, and the pressure of creating something that could stand alongside Resident Evil while feeling distinct. The decision to create a sequel was partly financial. Silent Hill had proven commercially viable, but also creative. Producer Akihiro Imamura read every comment and review about the original game, cataloging what players loved and what frustrated them. The team wanted to improve on the foundation they'd built, but they also wanted to explore different emotional territory. Where the first game centered on occult ritual, cults, and a girl with tremendous psychic power, the second game would focus on something more intimate: personal guilt, marital tragedy, and the question of whether a mercy killing can ever truly be mercy. Team Silent consisted of approximately 50 people for Silent Hill 2's development. The core creative team from the first game, Toyama as director, Masahiro Ito as art director and monster designer, and Akira Yamaoka as composer and sound director, remained. But they brought in roughly 30 additional people from Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo to handle the expanded scope. The PlayStation 2 offered significantly more power than the original PlayStation, which meant better graphics, more detailed environments, and longer draw distances, though they would deliberately choose to obscure much of that capability with their signature fog. The team made an early and crucial decision. Silent Hill 2 would not be a direct sequel to the first game. Harry Mason's story had reached a natural conclusion, with multiple endings but ultimately a sense of resolution. Creating a direct sequel would have required choosing one ending as canon and potentially diluting the original's impact. Instead, they opted for something riskier, a standalone story set in the same town, but featuring entirely new characters, with no connection to the cult, Alessa, or any of the first game's mythology. This creative freedom allowed Toyama and scenario writer Hiroyuki Iwaku to explore darker, more psychologically complex territory. The first game's horror came largely from external threats, monsters created by Alessa's power, the Order's plans, cosmic forces beyond human understanding. Silent Hill 2's horror would be internal, projected. The town would still have its reality warping properties, but this time the manifestations would be deeply, specifically personal to the protagonist. Every monster James Sunderland encounters would be a reflection of his psyche, his guilt, his repressed desires. This wasn't just a different story, it was a different philosophy of horror. Masahiro Ito, tasked with designing the game's creatures, took a fundamentally different approach than he had with the first game. Where Silent Hill's monsters were often insectoid or reptilian, the Grey Children, the Rompers, creatures that felt alien and otherworldly, Silent Hill 2's creatures would be disturbingly humanoid. They would wear the shapes of people, but twisted, broken, wrong in specific ways that communicated psychological states rather than physical threats. Ito drew inspiration from the painter Francis Bacon, whose distorted human figures convey anguish and existential horror, as well as from Horst Janssen and Magdalena Abakanowicz, artists who explored themes of decay, vulnerability, and the human condition. The famous pyramid head began as a painting Ito created after finishing work on the first game, titled 3310. It depicted a figure with a triangular head standing in water. Ito liked the design so much he decided to incorporate it into Silent Hill 2, giving it the name Red Pyramid Thing, and designing it as James's personal executioner. Guilt given physical form, punishment that pursues relentlessly. The iconic helmet was inspired by the historical paintings of executioners from Toluca Prison that appear in the game's historical society, creating a visual link between the town's violent past and James's present judgment. Akira Yamaoka continued his role as composer and sound designer, but for Silent Hill 2, he pushed his aesthetic even further. The original game's soundtrack had been effectively unsettling, using industrial noise and ambient sound to create tension. For the sequel, Yamaoka wanted to incorporate more melodic elements, genuine, emotionally affecting music that would make players feel sadness, not just fear. He spent 3 days at his home writing Theme of Laura, the game's main theme, combining what he called a sad melody with a strong beat. The track became iconic, though Yamaoka himself notes it wasn't actually written as Laura's theme. She was simply the first character he saw in completed cutscenes, so the title stuck. The soundtrack would feature 30 tracks, blending Yamaoka's industrial sensibilities with moments of heartbreaking beauty. Promise, the game's emotional centerpiece, would showcase Yamaoka's guitar work in a piece that sounds less like video game music and more like genuine emotional expression, the kind of song that could exist independently and still devastate listeners. This balance between beauty and horror, between melody and noise, would become Yamaoka's signature and one of the most distinctive elements of the Silent Hill series. The team also implemented several technical and design improvements based on player feedback from the original game. The camera system, while still using fixed angles in some areas, gave players more control. Combat felt slightly more responsive, though deliberately remained clunky to maintain the sense of vulnerability that had worked so well in the first game. Save points were more frequent and didn't require consumable items like Resident Evil's ink ribbons. Team Silent wanted players to be able to stop playing without losing significant progress, respecting that horror games are emotionally exhausting and shouldn't punish players for needing breaks. Perhaps most significantly, the team implemented a sophisticated behavioral tracking system for the game's multiple endings. Rather than presenting players with obvious moral choices or binary decision points, Silent Hill 2 would quietly track dozens of behaviors throughout the entire playthrough. How often players checked their health, whether they examined certain items, how they prioritized different characters' safety, even whether they healed quickly or spent time at low health. These seemingly minor actions would collectively determine which of the game's 6 endings players received, creating a system where the game essentially psychoanalyzed the player's approach and delivered a conclusion that reflected their playstyle and priorities. Development took approximately 2 years, with Team Silent working to create not just a bigger game than the original, but a more thematically coherent and emotionally devastating one. They were creating a horror game about love gone wrong, about the gap between how we see ourselves and what we're actually capable of, about grief and guilt and the lies we tell ourselves to keep functioning. The commercial success and critical acclaim the game would achieve suggested they succeeded, but the real measure of their success would be how the game continued to resonate with players decades later, inspiring countless analyses, discussions, and eventually a full remake that would bring James's story to a new generation. In my restless dreams, the story of James Sunderland. Silent Hill 2 begins in a bathroom, not in Silent Hill itself, but at a rest area overlooking Toluca Lake, where James Sunderland stands before a mirror talking to himself, trying to convince himself and us that what he's about to do makes any kind of sense. "Mary," he begins, his voice flat and exhausted. "I got a letter. From you." The impossibility of that statement hangs in the air. Mary died 3 years ago. The letter shouldn't exist. But James has driven to this fog-bound town because the letter told him to come, told him Mary was waiting at their special place. As James explains this to his reflection, we see a man grasping at impossible hope, unable or unwilling to process the contradiction in what he's saying. This opening scene, deceptively simple, sets up everything that follows. James is unreliable, desperate, and hiding something even from himself. The walk from the observation deck into Silent Hill proper is deliberately long, giving players time to absorb the atmosphere and James's situation before the horror begins. The town appears abandoned, buildings locked, streets empty except for the omnipresent fog that obscures everything beyond a few feet. James has a map, but no clear destination. Mary mentioned our special place, but didn't specify where, so he walks, searching, hoping to stumble across whatever location she meant. This aimlessness is part of the game's genius. Most games give players clear objectives and destinations. Silent Hill 2 lets you wander, lost, just as James is lost emotionally and psychologically. The monsters appear gradually. First comes a strange sound over the pocket radio James finds, a static burst that indicates something hostile nearby. Then the lying figures shamble into view, human-shaped, but wrapped in their own flesh like straitjackets, struggling within themselves, occasionally vomiting acid in desperate, violent releases. They're disturbing not because they're particularly dangerous. James can defeat them with some effort, but because of what they represent visually. These are creatures trapped inside themselves, unable to break free, struggling against bindings they can't escape. For players who don't yet know James's full story, the lying figures are simply unsettling enemies. Later, understanding what James has done, They become clear symbols of his inability to confront his truth, the way he's bound himself in layers of denial and self-deception. James encounters three other people in Silent Hill: Angela Roscoe, a teenage girl searching for her mother; Eddie Dombrowski, another young person who seems to be hiding from something; and Laura, an 8-year-old girl who knows Mary but acts like Mary died recently, not 3 years ago. These encounters are brief and strange, establishing that James isn't alone but not providing the comfort that usually comes from meeting other humans in horror settings. Angela is clearly traumatized, speaking cryptically about looking for her mother and seeming perpetually on the edge of breakdown. Eddie appears defensive and hostile, his explanations for why he's in Silent Hill shifting in suspicious ways. And Laura treats James with open contempt, insisting he's lying about caring for Mary because Mary died last year, not 3 years ago as James claims. Laura's words don't register with James as the contradiction they are, or if they do, he doesn't acknowledge it. The cognitive dissonance is visible even in how he responds, deflecting rather than engaging with this challenge to his timeline. The real turning point comes when James meets Maria. She appears in Rosewater Park, beside the lake. Impossibly, a woman who looks exactly like Mary, except for her clothing, demeanor, and personality. Where Mary was modest and gentle, Maria dresses provocatively and acts flirtatious. Where Mary was sick and suffering, Maria exudes vitality. She attaches herself to James immediately, offering to help him search for Mary, making comments that suggest intimacy they shouldn't share, moving with a sexuality that both attracts James and makes him uncomfortable. Maria knows things only Mary should know, details about James's life, shared memories, but explains these away breezily, as if shared knowledge between strangers is perfectly normal. Maria becomes James's constant companion through much of the game, and through her, the game explores one of its central themes, the fantasy of replacement. James loved Mary, but Mary became sick, became difficult, became a burden he resented even as he felt guilty for that resentment. Maria represents an impossible wish. What if Mary could come back but without the illness, without the suffering, without the parts of their relationship that became painful? Maria is Mary perfected according to James's damaged psyche, and her presence forces James and players to confront the ugliness of that fantasy. You can love someone and still wish they were different. You can grieve someone and still feel relief they're gone. These are uncomfortable truths, and Silent Hill 2 doesn't flinch from them. The journey takes James through locations that map his psychological landscape. The apartment buildings, Woodside and Blue Creek, are oppressively domestic, filled with locked doors and notes from former residents suggesting small tragedies and domestic failures. The hospital, Brookhaven, is where Mary received treatment and where James visited her through her illness, so every corridor carries the weight of his medical trauma, the sterile environments where he watched her deteriorate, the procedures that failed to help, the gradual realization that she wasn't going to get better. The prison complex beneath the historical society represents judgment and punishment, places where James unconsciously knows he deserves to be. And finally, the Lakeview Hotel, the place where James and Mary stayed during their last happy vacation, before the symptoms started, before everything went wrong. Throughout this journey, Maria dies repeatedly. Pyramid Head impales her in a hospital hallway, while James watches helplessly from behind bars. Later, she's found dead again in a locked room. Each death is traumatic, forcing James to watch the woman who looks like his wife die over and over, unable to prevent it. But each time, she reappears alive elsewhere, as if the death hadn't happened, creating a nightmarish cycle where loss becomes routine, and James is to protect anyone. Even this impossible recreation of Mary is proven inadequate again and again. These deaths serve multiple purposes. They're punishment for James, reminders of Mary's death, and demonstrations that Maria isn't real in any permanent sense. She's a manifestation, a projection, something the town has created from James's desires and guilt, and like all manifestations in Silent Hill, she exists to torment rather than comfort. The game's other characters pursue their own tragic arcs. Angela's story unfolds through brief, haunting encounters. In a cemetery, she contemplates suicide beside a grave that may be her father's. In an abstract, maze-like complex, James finds her confronting a monstrous thing on a bed. Abstract Daddy, a creature so obviously symbolic of sexual abuse that the game never needs to explain it. Angela reveals through fragments and implications that her father abused her, that she killed him in self-defense before coming to Silent Hill, and that the town has manifested her trauma in forms even more explicit than James's guilt. In their final meeting, Angela climbs a staircase surrounded by flames. Her Silent Hill is always burning, always hot, always the opposite of the fog and cold James experiences. She tells James he's lucky to have fog instead of fire, and she walks up into the flames, choosing her ending while James can only watch. It's one of the most devastating moments in the game. Two people suffering in the same town, but unable to help each other because their horrors are too personal, too specifically tailored. Eddie's arc is more directly violent. In the apartment complex, James finds him in a bathroom next to a corpse, making jokes about vomiting. Eddie's nervous and defensive, his explanations changing, his story inconsistent. Later encounters reveal Eddie as someone who snapped after years of bullying. He maimed his tormentor and killed a dog, possibly more, and Silent Hill has given him targets that look like the people who hurt him. In a meat locker, Eddie has been shooting human-shaped corpses, and when James confronts him, Eddie attacks. James kills him in self-defense, but the moment is significant. It's the first time James explicitly kills a human being, or at least something human-shaped that bleeds and dies like a person. The parallels between James and Eddie are uncomfortable. Both came to Silent Hill running from guilt over deaths they caused. The difference is that James can maintain his self-image as a victim of circumstances, while Eddie has fully embraced being a perpetrator. The truth about Mary crystallizes in the Lakeview Hotel. James finds room 312, their room from that final vacation. Inside is a videotape. He plays it, and the screen fills with footage of James and Mary exploring Silent Hill in happier times, smiling, laughing, enjoying each other's company. But the tape continues past where memory claims it should end. The scene shifts to a hospital room. Mary is in bed, weak and suffering. James enters with a pillow. What happens next is shown but not dwelled upon. James smothering Mary, her struggles gradually stopping. James breaking down after it's done. The mercy killing he convinced himself was some distant past event happened recently, maybe weeks ago, not 3 years. The entire timeline James has constructed, 3 years of being a widower, 3 years of grief, is a lie he told himself to avoid confronting what he did. This revelation recontextualizes everything. The letter from Mary that brought James to Silent Hill becomes clearly impossible. She couldn't have written it after death, so either James fabricated it unconsciously or the town itself generated the summons. The monsters are manifestations of James's guilt over killing Mary, his sexual frustration during her illness, his objectification of women, his death wish. Maria exists because James wanted Mary back, but better, more sexual, less sick, without the burden. Pyramid Head pursues him as the punishment he subconsciously craves. Even the town's geography reflects his psychological journey. Starting in denial, the fog-obscured streets where nothing is clear, moving through domestic spaces and medical trauma, descending into judgment and punishment, and finally arriving at the place where memory confronts reality. The game's climax depends on player behavior throughout the journey. There are 6 possible endings, each reflecting how the player has approached James's story. In the leave ending, generally considered the most hopeful, James confronts Mary's spirit in the hotel, receives her forgiveness, and leaves Silent Hill with Laura, choosing to live despite his guilt. In the in-water ending, James drives his car into Toluca Lake with Mary's body in the passenger seat, finally joining her in death as perhaps he always intended. The Maria ending shows James choosing the fantasy over the reality, leaving with Maria already seeing her cough and realizing he's trapped in a cycle, turning Mary's replacement into another burden. The rebirth ending involves occult rituals to revive Mary, suggesting James's desperation would drive him to any lengths, even ones that don't make sense. The dog ending is pure comedy. Everything was secretly orchestrated by a Shiba Inu in a secret room controlling the town. And the UFO ending brings aliens who abduct James, another joke ending that serves as pressure release after the game's intensity. These endings aren't arbitrary or determined by a single choice at the climax. They're the result of the game watching how you played. Did you prioritize Maria's safety or treat her as expendable? Did you examine items related to Mary frequently, suggesting obsessive memory or ignore them? Did you keep James healthy or let him stay injured, suggesting a death wish? Did you read the diary on the hospital roof about resurrection? The game tracks dozens of these behaviors and delivers an ending that reflects your approach to James's character, essentially making the player complicit in whatever James becomes. It's a remarkable system, one that makes Silent Hill 2 feel less like a story you're experiencing and more like a psychological profile being constructed around your choices. The genius of Silent Hill 2's narrative isn't just in the twist, though the revelation about Mary's death is devastating, but in how every element supports the themes. This is a story about self-deception, about the stories we tell ourselves to remain functional, about how love and resentment can coexist, about whether there's redemption after unforgivable acts. James didn't kill Mary out of malice, but out of exhaustion and misguided mercy, which makes it harder to judge him simply evil. He loved her and killed her. Both things are true. That complexity, that refusal to provide easy answers or moral certainty, is what elevates Silent Hill 2 above typical horror narratives into something that continues to generate discussion and analysis more than 2 decades later. The geography of guilt, environments, and symbolism. Silent Hill 2 takes place in a different section of the town than the first game explored, opening up areas previously inaccessible and establishing a geography that reflects James's psychological journey. The town is divided into several major locations, each serving specific thematic purposes while contributing to the overall atmosphere of abandonment and decay. The journey begins at the observation deck overlooking Toluca Lake, a spot designated for tourists to appreciate the scenic beauty of the area. It's peaceful, almost normal, which makes the descent into Silent Hill proper feel like a crossing of thresholds. The woods between the parking area and the town are deliberately long, winding, and disorienting. You're given time to absorb the wrongness of the fog before encountering anything overtly hostile. When James finally reaches the town itself, the streets are empty, buildings are locked, and the fog obscures everything beyond immediate surroundings. This opening section establishes that James is alone, that help isn't coming, that he'll have to navigate this nightmare with only a map and his diminishing certainty about why he's here. The apartment complexes, Woodside Apartments and Blue Creek Apartments, serve as the game's first major interior locations, and they're masterfully designed to create domestic unease. These aren't fancy locations or obviously sinister spaces. They're ordinary, run-down apartment buildings, the kind of places where working-class people live modest, quiet lives. The ordinariness is part of what makes them unsettling. The apartments are filled with evidence of the former residents, furniture left behind, belongings still in place, notes and diary entries revealing small personal tragedies. A woman waiting for a man who never came back. A tenant complaining about noise from the apartment above. Simple, mundane human dramas that make the emptiness more pronounced. The level design forces James through claustrophobic hallways with poor lighting into apartments where the layout suggests real spaces people lived in rather than video game arenas. Some doors are locked, others lead nowhere useful, creating the frustration of being somewhere domestic but unable to navigate it freely. The mannequin enemies appear here, creatures that are literally two pairs of legs fused at the waist, grotesquely sexual, objectified, broken. Their presence in these domestic spaces adds a layer of sexual threat to environments that should be safe. The apartments represent James's anxiety about intimate spaces, about domesticity, about the private lives of couples behind closed doors where things might go wrong without anyone outside knowing. Brookhaven Hospital is where Silent Hill 2's symbolism becomes most explicit and most devastating. Mary received treatment here during her illness, so every corridor carries traumatic associations for James. The design emphasizes medical sterility, white tiles, harsh fluorescent lighting, equipment that suggests procedures and suffering. But as James moves deeper, the hospital transitions from merely abandoned to actively hostile. The Otherworld version features rust-covered gurneys, blood-stained walls, and an oppressive industrial aesthetic that transforms a place meant for healing into a place of torture. The bubblehead nurses appear here, arguably the game's most iconic enemy after Pyramid Head, dressed in provocative versions of traditional nurse uniforms with mini-skirts and low-cut tops, their faces hidden behind masses of bubbled flesh. They move with jerky, aggressive motions and attack with pipes. Masahiro Ito has confirmed that these creatures represent James's sexual frustration and his complex feelings toward women in medical roles during Mary's illness. The nurses who cared for Mary became figures of both gratitude and inappropriate attraction in James's deteriorating psyche. The bubblehead nurses sexualize caregiving while also making it monstrous, embodying James's guilt over feeling sexual desire while his wife was dying. The hospital's puzzles and documents reinforce themes of sickness, loss, and futile treatment. James finds patient records, medical equipment, and areas suggesting experimentation or failure. There's a diary from a man caring for his daughter, watching her condition deteriorate despite all medical intervention, a clear parallel to James's experience with Mary. The hospital represents not just medical trauma, but James's helplessness in the face of Mary's illness, his inability to fix her despite all the resources of modern medicine, and ultimately his decision to end her suffering through means completely outside medical protocol. The Historical Society seems at first like a break from personal symbolism, a museum displaying Silent Hill's history, paintings of executioners, exhibits about the town's past, But the building's significance becomes clear when James descends through a maintenance passage that keeps going down, impossibly far, way past where a basement should end, until he emerges in Toluca Prison. This transition from public historical record to the actual site of punishment literalizes one of the game's core ideas. Beneath the surface of any place lies its true nature, its history of violence and judgment that society prefers to display safely in museums rather than confront directly. Toluca Prison is pure punishment mythology. The cells are small, the conditions brutal, and at the center of the complex is a gallows, still functional, ready for use. James encounters paintings here depicting the prison's executioners, whose distinctive triangular helmets are the clear inspiration for Pyramid Head's design. The prison represents guilt-seeking judgment, James's unconscious desire for punishment, the belief that what he's done deserves legal and cosmic retribution. The enemies here include more aggressive lying figures and mannequins, but the space itself is the real horror, the architecture of systematic, sanctioned violence. Society's machinery for punishment made physical. The labyrinth complex is abstract rather than realistic, featuring impossible geometries, floating staircases, and environments that transition between hotel spaces, prison cells, and areas that don't correspond to any real location. This is where James encounters Angela for the final time, where she faces abstract daddy. The labyrinth represents the breakdown of rational geography, the collapse of the mind's ability to map reality, James's total descent into psychological spaces rather than physical ones. It's significant that this section comes late in the game, after hours of traversing recognizable, if nightmarish versions of real places. The game admits that James has passed beyond physical space into pure psychological projection. The Lakeview Hotel is the final major location, and it's loaded with significance as the place where James and Mary stayed during their last happy vacation. The hotel's design emphasizes faded grandeur. It was once a nice resort, but has fallen into neglect, much like James and Mary's relationship deteriorated, from romantic happiness into resentful caretaking. The normal version of the hotel is empty but recognizable, with guest rooms, a restaurant, lobby areas suggesting the tourist destination it once was. Room 312, their room, contains the videotape that reveals the truth about Mary's death. But there's also an otherworld version of the hotel reached by descending a long staircase, and this version is flooded and corroded. Water drips from everywhere. Rust covers every surface. The walls weep moisture. If fire is Angela's element, water is James's. Toluca Lake has been a constant presence throughout the game, and water represents both memory and death. The flooded hotel is memory corroded by guilt, happy recollections poisoned by what came after. James navigates through knee-deep water, past rooms that suggest the hotel's history, until he reaches the final confrontation. Each location in Silent Hill 2 works on multiple levels simultaneously, as a playable environment with puzzles and challenges, as a source of atmospheric horror through lighting and sound design, and as a symbolic space reflecting James's mental state. This layered approach to level design was relatively rare in 2001 and remains impressive today. The game trusts players to pick up on symbolic meanings without spelling them out explicitly, assuming that the emotional resonance will communicate even if the specific interpretations vary. The otherworld transitions deserve particular attention. Unlike the first Silent Hill, where sirens announce shifts between normal and nightmare states, Silent Hill 2's transitions are often more subtle. Sometimes James walks through a door and finds himself in the otherworld version without fanfare. Sometimes he'll descend a staircase, and the environment gradually transforms around him. These quieter transitions emphasize that the distinction between normal Silent Hill and the other world isn't as clear for James as it was for Harry Mason. James is already so deep in his psychological crisis that both states feel equally unreal. The attention to detail in environmental storytelling is remarkable. Blood patterns on walls suggest violence but also artistic expression. Masahiro Ito's influence from Francis Bacon's paintings is visible in how blood and rust become almost decorative, horrible but also somehow aesthetic. Graffiti on walls often contains phrases that resonate with James's situation. Danger, there was a hole here, it's gone now. Messages that could be warnings or acknowledgments of absences. Bodies appear positioned in ways that suggest stories. A corpse slumped in a wheelchair, someone who died reaching towards something, victims frozen in their final moments. The maps themselves are well designed, showing James's progress while still allowing for disorientation. Unlike many games where maps are purely functional, Silent Hill 2's maps feel like tourist materials James might actually have found, complete with notes he's added marking locked doors or objectives. This attention to diegetic detail, making game elements feel like objects that exist within the game world, helps maintain immersion even when players are checking objectives or planning routes. The recurring motif of mirrors, windows, and reflective surfaces throughout the game creates a constant theme of doubling and self-confrontation. James sees himself reflected in mirrors that make him question what he's looking at. Windows that should show exteriors instead reveal darkness or impossible spaces. Water reflects but also distorts. These reflective surfaces underscore the game's themes about self-deception and the gap between how we see ourselves and what we actually are. The geometry of the town itself, with its frequent dead ends and looping pathways, creates a sense of being trapped in cycles, unable to make forward progress, forced to revisit the same spaces. This matches James's psychological state, stuck in his guilt, unable to move beyond what he's done, cycling through the same self-recriminations and justifications. The environment becomes an expression of his mental imprisonment, beautiful in its horror, precise in its design, unforgettable in its atmosphere. Manifestations of the mind, monster design, and symbolism. Masahiro Ito's approach to designing Silent Hill 2's monsters was fundamentally different from his work on the first game, where Silent Hill featured creatures that felt alien, insectoid, reptilian, clearly not human. Silent Hill 2's monsters are disturbingly humanoid, twisted versions of human forms that communicate specific psychological states. Ito has stated that he designed these creatures to be projections of James's psyche, manifestations of his guilt, his repressed desires, and his fractured relationship with Mary. Each monster serves both as a gameplay obstacle and as a walking symbol, contributing to the narrative in ways that transcend simple enemy encounters. The lying figure is the first monster James encounters, and it establishes the game's visual language immediately. Wrapped in what appears to be its own flesh like a straitjacket, the creature can barely walk, shambling forward with arms bound against its body. Periodically it stops, its upper body convulses, and it vomits a spray of corrosive fluid. The design communicates entrapment, repression, something struggling within bindings it can't escape. Thematically, the lying figure represents James's denial and self-deception. He's trapped himself in a false narrative about Mary's death, bound by his own psychological defenses. A occasionally lashing out in violent releases of the truth he's trying to contain. Ito has confirmed that all of Silent Hill 2's creatures, except Pyramid Head, are female, as they're James's projections of Mary. This detail reframes how we understand these monsters. They're not random threats, but specific manifestations of James's feelings toward his dead wife. The lying figure's gendered design isn't obvious visually, but knowing this adds another layer. These are feminine forms completely hidden, rendered shapeless and sexless, which reflects how Mary's illness progressively erased her identity in James's eyes, reducing her from a person to a burden, a body that needed care rather than a woman he loved. The mannequin is, perhaps, the most overtly sexual of the game's creatures, and certainly one of the most disturbing. It's literally two pairs of legs joined at the waist. No torso, no head, just legs in high heels and suggestive positions. The mannequins appear in the apartment complexes early in the game and recur in various locations afterward. They're aggressive, quick, and their design is so blatantly sexual that it becomes uncomfortable rather than titillating. Ito designed them to represent James's sexual frustration and his objectification of women during Mary's long illness. As Mary became sicker, unable to fulfill sexual aspects of their relationship, James's frustration grew alongside his guilt for feeling that frustration. The mannequins externalize this, their bodies without identity, sex without connection, female forms reduced to their sexual aspects and made monstrous in the reduction. The fragmentation of the mannequins, legs without bodies, disconnected parts, also suggests how illness fractured James's perception of Mary. Instead of seeing his wife as a whole person, he began seeing her in pieces, the sick body that needed care, the absent sexuality he resented losing, the emotional needs he felt burdened by. The mannequins literalize this fragmentary perception, creating something that isn't whole, isn't functional, isn't even really alive in any normal sense, but still moves and threatens. Pyramid Head, formerly called the Red Pyramid Thing, is the game's most iconic creation, a monster that has transcended Silent Hill 2 to become emblematic of the entire series despite Ito's protests that it was designed specifically for James's story. The design is immediately striking, a human-ish figure dragging an enormous blade, its head completely encased in a triangular metal helmet, wearing a butcher's apron stained with blood. The helmet is based on the triangular hoods worn by executioners in historical paintings found in the Historical Society, creating a visual link between Silent Hill's past violence and James's present judgment. Pyramid Head first appears in the apartment complex in a scene that traumatized many players. James, exploring, enters a room to find two mannequins. Before he can react, Pyramid Head appears and begins violently assaulting them, the scene clearly coded as sexual violence. James watches from a closet, unable to look away, witnessing Pyramid Head's brutality. Later, Pyramid Head will kill Maria repeatedly, while James watches helplessly. Each death forcing James to confront his inability to protect, his impotence in the face of punishment. Ito has explained that Pyramid Head represents James's guilt and his unconscious desire for punishment. James knows, on some level, that what he did to Mary deserves judgment, deserves consequences he hasn't faced in the legal system. Pyramid Head is that judgment made flesh, pursuing James relentlessly, executing other creatures, serving as constant reminder that someone must answer for Mary's death. The design's executioner imagery makes this explicit. This is formal, ritualized punishment, not random monster violence. The fact that James can't really defeat Pyramid Head in conventional combat reinforces this. You can't fight your own guilt into submission. You can only flee from it or accept it. The creature's sexuality, its phallic helmet, its violent treatment of feminine forms, adds another dimension. Pyramid Head enacts violent domination over the manifestations of James's desires, punishing the sexual frustration and objectification those other monsters represent. Its guilt, punishing desire, super-ego attacking ID, James's conscience made concrete and granted a blade. The scene where James watches Pyramid Head assault the mannequins forces James and players to witness the psychic violence underlying his frustrations. If James's sexual frustration manifests as dehumanized female body parts, then his guilt manifests as a force that violently dominates and destroys those very objectifications. The Bubblehead nurses appear exclusively in Brookhaven Hospital, and they're designed to evoke both sexual attraction and deep unease. Dressed in short nurse uniforms with low necklines, their faces are completely obscured by bubbled, twitching flesh. You can see them breathing, moving, but never see features. They move in jerky, convulsive ways, switching between standing still and sudden aggressive charges, attacking with pipes. The nurses represent James's complex feelings toward the medical staff who cared for Mary. Gratitude mixed with inappropriate attraction. Care mixed with proximity to suffering and death. Ito's design emphasizes the disconnect between sexualized appearance and horrific reality. The uniforms are provocative, designed to attract male gaze, but the faces are nothing, absence covered in corrupted flesh. This visualization captures how James experienced attraction to other women during Mary's illness, while simultaneously feeling horrified at himself for that attraction. The nurses aren't Mary, but they're feminine forms in the hospital environment where Mary suffered, creating a confusion between caregiver, sexual object, and death that James couldn't resolve and that manifests as these twitching, aggressive creatures. Abstract Daddy appears in Angela's storyline, but James must fight it, and it's one of the game's most disturbing designs. The creature consists of two figures on a bed frame merged into a single monstrous entity, one figure pressed on top of the other in a configuration unmistakably suggesting sexual assault. The design doesn't hide what it represents. This is Angela's sexual abuse by her father made physical, trauma given form. That James has to fight it while Angela can only flee emphasizes that different people's traumas can intersect but remain fundamentally separate. James can defeat Angela's monster, but doing so doesn't heal her or resolve her trauma. The boldness of this design was controversial even in 2001. Team Silent was creating a monster that directly represented childhood sexual abuse, making that horror visible and interactive. But they did so not gratuitously. The scene is brief, Angela's pain is centered, and the design communicates psychological horror rather than trying to be titillating. It's a monster that shouldn't exist, created by violence that shouldn't have happened, and its existence in Silent Hill 2 acknowledges that certain traumas are so severe they warp reality itself. Flesh Lips appear as a boss in the prison area, enormous, vaguely feminine figures imprisoned in hanging cages, their bodies distorted into grotesque proportions. The design suggests imprisonment, shame, bodies made into spectacle, feminine forms contained and displayed. In the context of the prison setting, they represent punishment and display, the way guilt seeks to imprison and exhibit its own suffering. James must kill them to progress, forcing engagement with these manifestations of suffering and confinement. The creatures that appear in the flooded hotel area, prisoners, are male, a rare exception to the game's general pattern. These humanoid figures wear restraints and move with purpose through the water, representing perhaps the masculine guilt James carries, or the prison of his own making that he inhabits in the final area. Their presence near the climax, when symbolism is giving way to direct confrontation with truth, suggests James recognizing his own imprisonment. What makes Silent Hill 2's monster design so effective is how it operates on multiple levels. On the surface level, these are just enemies, obstacles to overcome, threats to flee from, challenges that require resources and skill to defeat. But invest any thought into their designs, and they become texts to interpret, symbols that reward analysis, manifestations that tell you about James's psychology, whether he consciously recognizes it or not. A player can complete the game treating monsters as mere obstacles and still have a complete experience, but a player who thinks about why these specific monsters, in these specific forms, appear in these specific locations, gains a much deeper understanding of James's journey and the game's themes. Ito's artistic influences, Francis Bacon's distorted figures, the vulnerability and fragmentation of Magdalena Abakanowicz's sculptures are visible throughout. These aren't creature designs meant to look cool or sell action figures. They're meant to disturb, to communicate psychological states, to make players uncomfortable in ways that serve the narrative. The fact that Pyramid Head became popular and started appearing in later Silent Hill games despite having been designed specifically for James's story troubled Ito, who understood that the creature loses its meaning when detached from its original context. Pyramid Head is James's personal executioner, born from his specific guilt about Mary. Using it elsewhere dilutes its impact, turning a precisely calibrated symbol into a generic mascot. The environmental design of Silent Hill 2 ensures that monsters aren't just encountered randomly, but appear in contextually appropriate locations. Lying figures in streets where James is still in denial. Mannequins in domestic spaces where sexual frustration and objectification would have occurred. Nurses in the hospital where Mary received care. Pyramid Head in moments when James needs to be reminded of his guilt's consequences. This careful placement means that monster encounters are rarely just about combat challenge. They're narrative moments, environmental storytelling, ongoing character development through symbolic confrontation. The Sound of Silence, Akira Yamaoka's audio design. Akira Yamaoka's work on Silent Hill 2 represents a refinement and expansion of the audio philosophy he established with the first game, where Silent Hill's soundtrack emphasized industrial noise and ambient dread. Silent Hill 2 incorporates genuine musical beauty alongside the horror, creating an emotional range that supports the game's themes of love, loss, guilt, and grief. The result is one of the most celebrated video game soundtracks ever created, one that works both within the game and as standalone listening. The philosophy underlying Yamaoka's approach was radical for horror games. In 2001, silence is more effective than sound. Rather than filling every moment with ominous music or ambient loops, Silent Hill 2 embraces quiet. Long stretches of gameplay occur with minimal audio, just James's footsteps, distant water dripping, the occasional creak of settling structures. This creates a baseline of tension where players become hyper-aware of any sound that does occur. When the radio suddenly bursts with static, when a distant scream echoes through fog, when music finally begins, these moments hit with maximum impact because they puncture genuine silence. Theme of Laura serves as the game's main theme, playing during the opening preview and establishing the emotional tone. Yamaoka composed it in 3 days, combining what he described as a sad melody with a strong beat. The track features prominent guitar work over a driving rhythm, creating something that feels less like typical video game music and more like a genuine rock ballad. The melody is immediately memorable, melancholic without being oppressively dark, suggesting emotion rather than pure dread. Interestingly, despite its name, the track isn't actually Laura's theme. Yamaoka named it after her simply because the first cutscene he saw completed featured Laura and the name stuck. The track incorporates elements from the original Silent Hills theme, creating musical continuity between games while establishing its own identity. From 2:03 to 2:15, the original Silent Hill melody plays, a subtle acknowledgement that while this is a different story with different characters, it's still Silent Hill, still connected to the town's broader mythology. This kind of attention to detail, embedding references that reward attentive listeners without making them obvious, characterizes Yamaoka's approach throughout the soundtrack. Promise is the soundtrack's emotional centerpiece, often cited by players as one of the most powerful pieces of video game music ever composed. Clocking in at 4 minutes and 39 seconds, it's an entirely instrumental guitar-driven track that plays during the Maria ending credits, though a softer acoustic version plays at the game's beginning. The track is pure emotion. Yamaoka's guitar work sounds almost vocal, as if the instrument is trying to communicate feelings words can't contain. There's anguish in the melody, regret, a desperate reaching for something lost. The production is relatively simple: guitar, drums, minimal additional instrumentation, which allows the emotional core to remain unobstructed. Players consistently report that Promise has made them cry, even divorced from the game context. It's a rare piece of music that can devastate listeners purely through instrumental performance and within the game's narrative context, playing as James's story concludes, whether in redemption or tragedy, it becomes almost unbearable. Yamaoka has stated that he wanted the music to evoke emotions in players, and with Promise, he succeeded to a degree unusual even for the medium. The track represents everything Silent Hill 2 is about: love that went wrong, choices that can't be undone, grief that can't be fully expressed, guilt that permeates everything. White Noise is the track that plays when Pyramid Head first appears, and it's pure sonic hostility, industrial percussion, harsh electronic noise, metallic scraping sounds layered into something that barely qualifies as music. It's more like the oral equivalent of machinery eating itself. The track creates immediate unease and aggression, sonically representing Pyramid Head's violent purpose. But interestingly, it's relatively short, because Pyramid Head encounters aren't prolonged boss fights. They're moments of pursuit and escape, so the music doesn't need to sustain for extended periods. The save point theme, heard at locations where James can preserve his progress, is gentle and melancholic, a simple piano melody that signals safety while maintaining the game's somber, emotional atmosphere. This is brilliant psychological design. The music becomes Pavlovian comfort, training players to feel relief when they hear it. After tense navigation through hostile environments, encountering a save point and hearing that piano melody creates a measurable emotional release. The game is giving you permission to breathe, and the music is the signal that it's safe to do so. Angel's Thanatos plays in certain areas and combines ambient noise with melodic elements, creating soundscapes that feel both musical and environmental. The tracks often blend so thoroughly with sound design that it's unclear where music ends and ambient sound begins. Is that a note or a machine sound? Is that melody or industrial noise? This ambiguity serves the game's reality-bending nature, making audio as unreliable and interpretable as the visual environment. Yamaoka's sound design work is equally important as his composition. The game uses approximately 50 distinct sound effects, each crafted to create unease or surprise. The footsteps have different sounds for different surfaces. Metal grating sounds distinctly different from wood flooring. Water splashing sounds different from dry pavement. This attention to audio feedback helps with spatial awareness and environmental immersion, but it also creates opportunities for false alarms. You hear footsteps that might be your own or might be something else. You hear scraping that could be environmental or could be Pyramid Head's blade dragging across metal. The radio static that signals nearby enemies is one of the game's most effective audio cues. It starts as a quiet crackle, increases in intensity as threats get closer, and reaches harsh, loud static when enemies are very near. This creates constant audio tension. You're always listening for that static, always on edge that it might spike, always wondering if that faint crackle you just heard was real or imagined. The radio essentially gamifies paranoia, giving it a mechanical system, and in doing so makes paranoia part of the core gameplay loop. Creature sounds are specific and disturbing. The lying figures make choking, struggling sounds even when not attacking, constantly vocalizing their trapped state. The mannequins skitter and rustle, suggesting movement that's not quite right. The bubblehead nurses breathe audibly through their obscured faces, creating disturbing breathing sounds that humanize them just enough to make their violence more unnerving. Pyramid Head's scraping blade creates a signature sound that induces instant dread. Once you've heard that metallic scrape, you know exactly what it means, and hearing it anywhere creates immediate fear response. Environmental audio is layered with care. Silent Hill's fog carries distant sounds, sirens, screams, crashes that suggest events happening just beyond visibility. Buildings creak and settle. Wind whistles through broken windows. Water drips endlessly in the hospital. The prison echoes with metallic clangs. The hotel groans with structural stress and rushing water. Each location has a sonic identity that contributes to its atmosphere independently of any music or sound effects. Just standing still in any environment and listening reveals careful audio design meant to create unease through suggestion and implication rather than overt scares. Yamaoka also employs silence strategically. After intense sequences with combat and sound effects, the game will often give you quiet areas where almost nothing is heard except your own actions. This isn't empty silence, it's purposeful silence, giving players time to process what they've experienced and building tension for whatever comes next. Horror requires valleys to make peaks effective, and Yamaoka understands this instinctively. The result is a game where silence becomes as important as sound, where absence of audio creates its own form of pressure. The soundtrack was released on October the 3rd, 2001, as Silent Hill 2 original soundtracks in Japan, containing 30 tracks. It was re-released in Europe the same year with different cover art. In 2019, Mondo released a vinyl version, treating the soundtrack as a legitimate musical work, deserving of the highest quality physical format. The enduring popularity of the soundtrack, its presence in Play, a video game symphony concerts, where Yamaoka performed alongside full orchestras, its frequent appearance in best video game music lists, its continued streaming and sales decades later, demonstrates that Yamaoka created something with cultural staying power beyond the game itself. The endings. 6 ways to process grief. Silent Hill 2's multiple ending system is one of its most sophisticated elements, a behavioral tracking mechanism that essentially psychoanalyzes the player and delivers a conclusion reflecting their approach to James's story. Unlike games that present obvious moral choices at key moments, do you save the child or steal their candy? Silent Hill 2 tracks dozens of subtle behaviors throughout the entire playthrough and uses accumulated data to determine which ending you receive. This creates an ending system where most players won't consciously know they've been making choices that matter, making the conclusion feel less like a reward for specific actions and more like an interpretation of who you've decided James is. The leave ending is generally considered the most hopeful and is often treated as the good ending by players, though Team Silent has never officially declared any ending canonical. In this ending, after James confronts Mary's spirit in the hotel and receives her forgiveness, he leaves Silent Hill with Laura, choosing to live despite his guilt and take responsibility for another life. The final scene shows them walking together through the fog toward the cemetery where Mary will presumably be buried properly, James accepting his role as guardian for this child who also loved Mary. The promise reprise that plays during this ending is gentle and sad but not hopeless. There's resolution, acceptance, a path forward, however difficult. This ending triggers based on behaviors suggesting James is seeking redemption and maintaining connection to Mary's memory. If you frequently examined Mary's letter and photograph, listened to her conversations on the hospital roof, prioritized your health, and generally played carefully and thoughtfully, the game interprets this as James, not being suicidal, not replacing Mary with Maria, but genuinely trying to understand and process what happened. The leave ending rewards this interpretation with the possibility of continuing life forever changed but not destroyed. The in-water ending is darker and for many players feels more thematically appropriate to James's situation. After the confrontation with Mary, James retrieves her body from the hotel room where he's apparently kept it, places it in the back seat of his car, and drives into Toluca Lake. The car plunges into the water, and James's final monologue, delivered as he drowns, is a confession and an acceptance of death as the only appropriate resolution. Mary, I'm going to where you are. I should have done this long ago. I couldn't kill myself before because I was too cowardly. But now I have you, so I won't be afraid. The screen fades to black underwater. Promise plays over the credits, and James has finally joined Mary in death, as perhaps he intended all along. This ending triggers based on self-destructive play patterns, staying at low health frequently, taking damage regularly, listening to the entire conversation on the hospital roof about suicide, examining Mary's letter and photos repeatedly in ways that suggest obsessive, unhealthy fixation rather than healing remembrance. The game interprets these behaviors as indicating James has a death wish, that his entire journey was unconsciously leading to self-destruction, and it delivers an ending where that death wish is fulfilled. For many players, In Water feels like the real ending because it resolves James's guilt in the most final way possible. He can't live with what he's done, so he doesn't. The Maria ending shows James choosing fantasy over reality. After defeating the final boss, James leaves Silent Hill with Maria, who now dresses and acts like Mary. But as they walk together, Maria begins to cough, and James's face shows recognition. He's created another burden, another sick woman he'll eventually resent, trapped in a cycle that will repeat. The ending is darkly ironic, suggesting that James has learned nothing, that he's choosing comfortable delusion over painful truth, that he'd rather have Mary's replacement than face her actual loss. The ending's final shot of Maria coughing while James walks ahead is deeply unsettling. Are we watching the beginning of another tragedy? This ending triggers if you prioritize Maria's safety throughout the game, rushing to her aid when she's threatened, checking on her frequently when she follows you, examining her closely, generally treating her as more important than Mary's memory. The game interprets this as James replacing his dead wife with her doppelganger, choosing sexual vitality over genuine connection, objectifying both women by treating them as interchangeable. The Maria ending is arguably the most psychologically damning because it suggests James is incapable of growth, doomed to repeat his mistakes. The rebirth ending is the strangest of the serious endings. After defeating the final boss, James takes Mary's body and rows a boat to a mysterious island in Toluca Lake where ancient ruins suggest occult practices. His intention, revealed through notes found during the game, is to use these ruins to resurrect Mary through ritual, bringing her back from death. The ending shows James rowing toward the island, determined to attempt impossible resurrection, even if it requires dark methods. This ending triggers if you found 4 specific ritual items hidden throughout the game: the White Chrism, Book of Lost Memories, Obsidian Goblet, and Book of the Crimson Ceremony, and examine them all. These items are easily missed and require deliberate searching, so this ending typically only occurs when players are explicitly seeking it through guides or subsequent playthroughs. Thematically, Rebirth suggests James's desperation would drive him to any lengths, even supernatural ones, that he's unable to accept Mary's death, even after confronting his role in it, that he'd rather attempt impossible resurrection than move forward. The dog ending is pure comedy and serves as important tonal release after the game's relentless darkness. In a secret room accessed late in the game, James discovers a Shiba Inu at a computer control panel, apparently orchestrating all of Silent Hill's horrors. The dog turns, James reacts with confusion, and the ending credits play over photos of the dog with various characters. It's absurd, hilarious, and completely breaks the game's reality, which is exactly the point. After the emotional devastation of the serious endings, the dog ending acknowledges that Silent Hill 2 is ultimately a video game, and it's okay to laugh. It's okay to find the absurdity in horror. The dog ending is Silent Hill 2 winking at players who've taken the journey seriously enough to unlock it. The UFO ending, added in the expanded versions, is even more elaborate comedy. James climbs to the observation deck and encounters aliens who abduct him. The twist: this is apparently a sequel to the first game's UFO ending. Harry Mason appears and jokes about James being abducted too, suggesting alien interference is the real explanation for everything. The ending features cheesy UFO effects and deliberately ridiculous voice acting. Like the dog ending, it's pure pressure release, acknowledgement that horror can coexist with humor, that games can be self-aware without undermining their serious content. The system that determines endings is remarkably sophisticated. The game tracks how often you examine Mary's letter and photo, how much time you spend at low health versus high health, whether you listen to the entire conversation on the hospital roof about suicide, how often you check on Maria when she's following you, how quickly you rescue Maria when she's in danger, whether you examine the ritual items hidden throughout the game, how you use health items immediately when hurt or waiting until nearly dead, various other behavioral metrics that accumulate throughout the playthrough. This data is weighted and combined to determine a score for each ending category. The game then delivers the ending corresponding to your highest score. The genius of this system is that it's largely invisible. Most players won't realize they're being analyzed, won't know which specific actions contribute to which endings, won't understand they've been making meaningful choices through unconscious play patterns. This transforms Silent Hill 2 from a story you experience into a story you collaborate on. The ending you receive reflects not just James's character, but your characterization of James, your interpretation of his psychology, your decisions about how to play him. Did you play carefully and healthily? You get the ending where James chooses life. Did you play recklessly, staying hurt, obsessing over Mary? You get the ending where James chooses death. Did you prioritize Maria? You get the ending where James chooses delusion. These aren't arbitrary relationships. They're psychologically coherent mappings between player behavior and narrative outcome. The ending system also adds significant replay value. Once you've seen one ending, you want to see others, want to understand what behaviors produce different results, want to explore alternate interpretations of James's story. This encourages multiple playthroughs, which in turn allows players to notice details they missed the first time, understand symbolism they didn't catch, appreciate the careful construction of narrative and environment that becomes more visible on subsequent journeys. Most importantly, the multiple ending system prevents Silent Hill 2 from having a single, definitive interpretation. There is no one true ending, no official canon resolution to James's story. Different players can have completely different experiences and feel equally valid in their interpretation. This ambiguity is essential to the game's lasting impact. It remains discussable, debatable, open to analysis and reanalysis. If there were one correct ending, the conversation would have ended decades ago. Instead, players still debate which ending is most thematically appropriate, which best serves James's character, which provides the most satisfying resolution. The game invites these debates by refusing to settle them. Cultural impact and legacy. Silent Hill 2, released on September the 24th, 2001, just 13 days after the September 11th attacks, entering a world that had suddenly become much darker and more uncertain. The timing was coincidental and unfortunate for marketing purposes, but in retrospect it feels almost appropriate. Here was a game about trauma, loss, guilt, and the impossibility of returning to innocence, releasing into a world collectively processing trauma. While the game's themes weren't directly related to 9/11, its emotional resonance perhaps struck differently than it would have in a more stable cultural moment. Initial reception was strong, but not universal. Silent Hill 2 sold over 1 million copies in its first month across North America, Japan, and Europe, with strongest performance in North America. Review scores were generally high. Metacritic shows an average of 89 out of 100 for the PlayStation 2 version. But some critics found the controls clunky, the combat frustrating, or the story too ambiguous. These criticisms, voiced in 2001, have aged poorly. The clunky controls are now understood as deliberate design serving vulnerability. The combat frustration is the point, and the ambiguous story is now celebrated as one of the game's greatest strengths. The game's reputation has grown steadily over the decades, a rare example of a title becoming more respected with time rather than fading into nostalgia. Early lists of great horror games would include Silent Hill 2, but it was often grouped with other contemporaries like Resident Evil. Over time, as more games attempted psychological horror and most failed to achieve Silent Hill 2's depth, the game began to be recognized as not just a great horror game, but one of the greatest games, period. Full stop, in any genre. Academic interest followed. Silent Hill 2 became the subject of scholarly analysis, in game studies, media studies, and psychology fields. Papers examined its treatment of grief, its symbolism, its narrative structure, its moral ambiguity. The game was taught in university courses on interactive media, held up as evidence that video games could handle mature, complex themes with sophistication matching or exceeding other narrative media. This academic validation helped establish that games could be taken seriously as texts worth studying, not just as entertainment or technical achievements. The game's influence on other titles was immediate and lasting. Fatal Frame, 2001, releasing just months after Silent Hill 2, showed clear influence in its atmospheric approach to horror and use of vulnerability as gameplay mechanic. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, took Silent Hill 2's lessons about vulnerability and removed combat entirely, creating a new subgenre of first-person horror. The Walking Dead game, 2012, by Telltale borrowed the idea of tracking player behavior to determine outcomes, though applied it more overtly than Silent Hill 2's subtle system. The influence extended beyond horror. The Last of Us, 2013, was explicitly inspired by Silent Hill 2's emotional storytelling and use of environments to communicate character psychology. BioShock Infinite, 2013, borrowed the idea of using impossible, shifting spaces to represent mental states. Spec Ops: The Line, 2012, applied Silent Hill 2's approach to trauma and guilt to military shooters, examining PTSD and moral injury through gameplay that grew increasingly uncomfortable. Masahiro Ito's monster designs became iconic beyond the game itself. Pyramid Head in particular achieved mascot status, appearing in later Silent Hill games despite Ito's protests that the creature was specifically designed for James's story and lost meaning when detached from that context. The creature appeared in Silent Hill, Homecoming, Silent Hill Revelation, the second film, and Dead by Daylight, among others. Ito has been vocal on social media about his displeasure with these uses, understanding that Pyramid Head's symbolic meaning is diluted when it becomes a generic villain rather than a specific manifestation of James's guilt. The Bubblehead nurses similarly became series icons, appearing in subsequent games and media. While this broader use makes some sense, nurses as a concept could appear in any character's Silent Hill experience that involves medical trauma. The specific design and behavior of the Silent Hill 2 nurses was tailored to James's psychology, and their reappearance elsewhere often feels more like brand recognition than thematic coherence. The game's multiple re-releases and ports demonstrated its enduring commercial viability. The Xbox version, December 2001, added the Born from a Wish scenario featuring Maria, giving players insight into her brief existence before meeting James. The PC port, 2002, added quick save functionality and a trailer gallery. The PlayStation 2 Greatest Hits re-release, 2002, incorporated all these additions. Each version found new audiences, and the PC version in particular developed a dedicated modding community that worked to improve the port's technical issues and restore features compromised in the translation to PC. The 2012 HD collection for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 was controversial. Developed by an outside team using incomplete source code, the HD collection featured numerous technical issues, missing effects, altered fog behavior, and changed lighting that fundamentally affected the game's atmosphere. The voice acting was re-recorded with new actors, though players could select the original voices for Silent Hill 2. The collection is generally considered an inferior way to experience the games, and the negative reception taught Konami and players that Silent Hill 2's carefully calibrated atmosphere couldn't be casually updated without understanding what made the original work. The PC modding community responded with the Enhanced Edition 2018, a compilation of mods that restored missing effects, improved resolution support, fixed compatibility issues, and generally made the PC version the definitive way to experience Silent Hill 2 on modern hardware. This community preservation effort demonstrated the passion Silent Hill 2 inspired. Players weren't willing to let the game fade into technical obsolescence or accept inferior re-releases. They took preservation into their own hands, spending countless hours reverse engineering and restoring what official channels had compromised. The game's impact on horror media extended beyond games. The 2006 Silent Hill film borrowed visual elements and atmosphere from both the first game and Silent Hill 2, though its story was primarily based on the first game. The 2012 sequel, Silent Hill Revelation, attempted to incorporate Pyramid Head despite the creature having no logical place in the film's narrative, demonstrating how the iconography had become more important to marketers than thematic appropriateness. Silent Hill 2's approach to horror as a vehicle for examining difficult emotions influenced television and film. The aesthetic of foggy, abandoned towns where reality breaks down appeared in numerous works. More importantly, the idea that horror could be about internal struggle rather than external threat, that monsters could be symbolic rather than purely threatening, that ambiguity could be more effective than clarity. These lessons spread through horror culture beyond just games. The announcement of a remake developed by Bloober Team in October 2022 sparked intense debate. Bloober's previous work on games like The Medium and Layers of Fear showed they understood psychological horror, but Silent Hill 2 was considered sacred ground by fans. Any remake would be scrutinized intensely, compared endlessly to the original, critiqued for every change. The announcement that Akira Yamaoka would return as composer and Masahiro Ito as creative consultant helped allay some concerns. The original creators were involved, suggesting this wouldn't be a careless cash grab. The remake released on October 8, 2024, for PlayStation 5 and PC to generally positive reception. Bloober Team's approach was careful and respectful, updating graphics and mechanics while preserving the original's atmosphere and story. The over-the-shoulder camera replaced fixed angles, making the game more accessible to modern audiences while potentially reducing some of the original's disorientation. Combat was slightly more responsive while remaining deliberately clunky. Most importantly, the emotional core remained intact. The remake understood that Silent Hill 2's power came from its story and themes, not from its specific technical implementation. The remake's success, both critically and commercially, proved Silent Hill 2's themes and narrative remained compelling nearly 25 years later. The story of James and Mary, of love and guilt, of mercy killings and self-deception, still resonated with players who hadn't been born when the original released. This multi-generational appeal is rare in games, where technical aging often makes older titles difficult to appreciate for audiences accustomed to modern design. Silent Hill 2 transcended its technical limitations because what it had to say mattered more than how it said it. The game's lasting legacy is perhaps best measured not in sales figures or review scores, but in the conversations it continues to generate. YouTube is filled with video essays analyzing the game's themes, symbolism, and narrative structure. Online forums maintain active discussions about ending interpretations. monster meanings, and environmental details players are still discovering decades later. The game appears regularly in greatest games of all time lists, often in the top 20 or 30 titles ever made across all genres and eras. Silent Hill 2 proved video games could tell mature, psychologically complex stories that rewarded analysis and discussion. It demonstrated that horror could be about more than jump scares and gore, that atmosphere and theme mattered as much as mechanics and challenges. It showed that ambiguity could be a strength rather than a weakness, that trusting players to interpret rather than explaining everything could create deeper engagement. These weren't just innovations for horror games, they were innovations for the medium as a whole, proving games could aspire to the depth and sophistication of the best literature and film. Conclusion: The Town That Won't Let Go. 24 years after James Sunderland walked into that fog-shrouded town, Silent Hill 2 remains as powerful and relevant as the day it released. The story of a man who killed his wife and can't admit it to himself, who builds elaborate psychological defenses that manifest as monsters and shifting realities, who must finally confront truth in a rotting hotel beside a lake that reflects everything. This story continues to devastate players who experience it for the first time, and to reveal new layers to players experiencing it for the 10th time. What makes Silent Hill 2 endure is not any single element, but how everything combines into something greater than the sum of its parts. Masahiro Ito's monster designs are brilliant, but they work because they serve specific psychological purposes. Akira Yamaoka's soundtrack is beautiful and haunting, but it's effective because it's carefully deployed rather than constant. The story is compelling, but it's elevated by the behavioral tracking system that makes players complicit in whichever version of James emerges. The environments are atmospheric, but they're meaningful because they reflect James's mental state. Everything serves the themes. Everything contributes to the emotional experience. Everything is crafted with intention and care. The game succeeds as horror, generating genuine dread and discomfort through atmosphere, sound design, and the slow realization of James's unreliability. It succeeds as interactive fiction, using gameplay system to tell story in ways only games can. It succeeds as psychological drama, examining grief, guilt, love, resentment, and self-deception with nuance and sophistication. And it succeeds as art, creating an experience that lingers long after the credits roll, that generates discussion and analysis, that means different things to different people while remaining coherent in its core themes. The genius of Team Silent was recognizing that horror games didn't have to follow Resident Evil's formula of action, puzzles, and resource management. They could be slower, quieter, more atmospheric. They could prioritize emotion over adrenaline, symbolism over spectacle, psychology over plot mechanics. They could trust players to sit with the discomfort, to wrestle with ambiguity, to accept endings that didn't provide neat resolution. This trust in audience intelligence and emotional maturity was rare in 2001 and remains relatively uncommon even today. Silent Hill 2 asks uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know ourselves? What are we capable of when pushed to extremes? Can love survive resentment? Can mercy be murder? How do we process guilt for actions we can't undo? Is redemption possible after unforgivable acts? These aren't questions with simple answers, and the game doesn't pretend to provide them. Instead, it creates a space for players to confront these questions through James's journey, to see themselves reflected in his struggles, to recognize that the gap between good person and terrible action is often smaller than we'd like to believe. The The town of Silent Hill itself becomes a character in this story, not a location but a mechanism, a mirror, a judgment system that reads guilt and generates appropriate punishment. It's not evil, it's responsive. It gives you what you unconsciously seek, whether that's punishment, replacement, escape, or some combination thereof. The town is therapy conducted through horror, forcing confrontation with truths you'd rather avoid. This concept, that horror could be therapeutic, that facing fears could be a path to understanding, was novel in gaming and remains one of Silent Hill 2's most compelling aspects. As we've explored tonight through this retrospective, Silent Hill 2 is a game that works on every level it attempts. As a horror game, it's terrifying. As a character study, it's complex and nuanced. As a technical achievement, it pushed the PlayStation 2's capabilities while working around its limitations creatively. As a narrative experience, it's sophisticated and emotionally devastating. As a cultural artifact, it's influenced countless games, films, and other media. As a piece of art, it's worthy of the analysis, discussion, and preservation it continues to receive. The 2024 remake's success demonstrates that these themes remain relevant, that new generations of players are ready to engage with horror that asks more of them than quick reflexes and pattern recognition. It shows that Silent Hill 2's emotional core was strong enough to survive translation to new technology, new audiences, new cultural contexts. The remake is not replacing the original. The original remains playable and important in its specific technical and historical context. But the remake ensures that the story of James and Mary, of guilt and grief, of love gone terribly wrong, will continue to find audiences who need to experience it. So tonight, as we reach the end of this retrospective, the fog lifts slightly but never fully clears. Silent Hill remains in the background, waiting for the next person who carries enough guilt to be drawn to its streets, the next story that needs to be told through its reality warping mechanisms. James's story is complete, but the town is patient. There's always another letter, another special place, another person who needs to confront what they've done in fog-shrouded streets where monsters wear the faces of their victims and punishment pursues with a blade scraping across metal. Silent Hill 2 is a game about a man, a town, a letter, and a lie. It's about the difference between the stories we tell ourselves and the truth we can't face. It's about whether redemption is possible, whether love can justify anything, whether death can be mercy. It's about fog and rust and water, about creatures that shouldn't exist but do, about a triangle-headed executioner dragging a blade through your nightmares. It's about a soundtrack that makes you cry and silence that makes you scared. It's about 6 different endings and the one that feels true to you specifically. Most of all, it's about the fact that sometimes the real horror isn't what's in the fog, it's what's in the mirror.